everyone, and welcome to the Dynamics 365 Practice Show. We're covering a huge amount of topics today with our next guest, Jason Ferguson, Solution Director from DXC in Perth, Australia. Today we pull apart the art of what it makes to do an effective bid, how to write a compelling value proposition, killer demo tips, how to price yourself at the right level, and what to keep in mind when pursuing awards and nominations. But before we do that, I'd like to tell you about this company I'm working with called MapTasker, which incidentally also hail from Perth in Western Australia. On episode number 70, I had the pleasure of interviewing David Newman, one of the founders of this new ISV. Check out that interview at nz365guy.com/70. I started working with MapTasker because I like the innovative way they're combining location intelligence, geospatial data, and artificial intelligence with data overlays including satellite and drone imagery. Their add-on for the Microsoft Power Platform allows you to add geospatial or mapping data to your existing datasets. And do you know that over 70% of datasets have a mapping component potentially available to them? So it allows you to bring to life some really exciting user cases that business leaders have been dreaming about for years. I also like that they provide a free mobile version to anyone running Dynamics 365 customer engagement. So if you're looking for the next generation mapping solution, go to maptasker.com for more information. MapTasker is spelled MAPTASKR.com. Now, let's get on with the show. But if you want to check out the show notes, go to nz365guy.com/93. Hey, Jason, welcome to the Dynamics 365 show.
Thanks, Mark. Great to be here.
Mate, it's good to have you on the show. You know, you've been one of my friends for a very, very long time. You know, over the time I worked in Australia and even before, you're the one that took me ultimately to Australia, gave me a job and all. So it's good to have you on the show and connect and really uncover your story.
Appreciate you having me on, Mark.
So, Jason, just tell us a bit about where you're from, where do you come from, where do you live, and what's your life made up like today?
Sure. So I live in Perth, Western Australia, the most isolated capital city in the world. So west coast of Australia, it's a 4-hour flight to the east coast, to Melbourne, Sydney, etc. They think we're about 40 years behind, but, you know, we won't go there. I mean, so Perth, I don't know if people have seen the Quokka selfies with all the celebrities liking to go across. That's, you know, an island about 40 minutes off the coast, ferry ride. That's probably our claim to fame.
So, I mean, the first time I ever heard about Perth and Fremantle was, of course, the America's Cup when Australia won it all those years ago.
That is a while ago. Yeah, correct. That's exactly right, mate.
Taking off the Americans. But I mean, you know, you say you're the furthest capital, you know, city away or remote, but I mean, Western Australia itself, I mean, how much larger than Texas is it?
Oh, it's about 4 times bigger than Texas. You know, it's a ridiculous...
4 times the size of Texas. Yeah.
That's right.
So it's a massive place, and it pretty makes up keeps the rest of Australia going, right, from all the taxation of mining and resource and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Massive mining industry over here. So, yeah, that's right. Drive the rest of the industry.
Nice. So what do you get up to in your spare time? Any interests or hobbies?
Big sports fan, so enjoy Australian rules football, thoroughbred horse racing. I own a few race horses, so very much into that. But any sports or sport-related things, generally up and about for, Mark.
Nice. And so recent times you've just moved into a solution director role at DXC, I see, and, you know, the companies that we were involved with in the past, of course, gone through various acquisitions. So you've made a pivot. What's your kind of feel for the role so far?
Well, as you know, DXC is a pretty massive organisation, so about 170,000 staff globally. There's a massive breadth of solutions they do, you know, end to end. So I'm part of Eclipse, which is their Australian Dynamics practice, a very large FinOps and Business Central, as well as Dynamics CE. Thus far, it's been a really great experience. You know, a big team. Obviously, I'm pretty new on board, only a couple of months now, but really looking forward to working closely with the wider team and building the capability across all of our different workloads into the future.
Yeah. So the reason I really was keen to get you on the show is that, you know, out of all the people I've worked with in my career, nobody could come close to you when it came to written, effective bid responses, the whole engagement to kind of get to that shortlist status and ultimately win deals. And I saw that happen not just in engagement with customer proposal, whether it be across federal government, you know, healthcare, or really any sector, mining, etc., that we pursued. You seem to have a kind of an art and a style to really answer a bid in a way that the customer was looking for, giving them that confidence. And ultimately, like any bid does, is is a risk assessment process, I suppose, for a company to make sure that they're in safe hands. So I'd like to drill into that subject. And so, first of all, let's explore the art of effective bid response. How do you assess whether an opportunity is even worth pursuing first?
Yeah, and that's a great question, to be honest. I think, as we all know, there's a healthy tension between sales and pre-sales. So sales always wanting to bid, let's go for this, clearly have quotas to make or do, but, resources are always constrained. So I think first and foremost, having some sort of quantified process, a document or something similar to help salespeople frame up, is this actually a good opportunity? And, and why they think it is. But I think from my perspective, it all comes down to the key. Can we win? How? So is it that we've got some IP that we can leverage? Have we got, be it either software IP or internal IP from our project delivery staff who have worked and successfully delivered those types of solutions? Do we have referenceability, either at a vendor level, if, as a partner, you might go, well, we don't, but we can see the vendor, Microsoft has delivered a couple of successful solutions in that space that you can reference, fantastic. But it's really asking the value proposition of why us? And I think a lot of people struggle with that sometimes, well, we're the best. Okay, well, that's great, but why? So actually sitting down and being able to quantify, and objectively, I guess, looking at it and saying, well, we know partner X is very strong in that space and they win a lot of business. How can we beat them? Now, that could be price, it could be some other things, but sort of objectively looking at all of those different elements and coming up with a decision.
Yeah. So that's interesting. You mentioned that knowing the strength of who perhaps other partners are involved or engaged or even competitors for that matter. And so how do you kind of weed out the concept of column fodder? You know that the company requires, their buying process might require 3 bid responses, and you're really in column 3 and they need you to respond, but they've already kind of pre-chosen, but they're following their internal processes. How do you kind of sniff that out and go, okay, we're not bidding for this because we're not giving away free time for something that's unwinnable?
That's exactly right. Well, I think a lot of it comes down to, the eyes and ears of your sales team. So if we're aware of something coming along, i.e., the customer's given us pre-advanced or we've engaged ahead of time and we understand their requirement quite well, then clearly, you're in that column 1 or 2. If you're in that column 3, well, do you or do you not go for it? It's a prime question. I guess a lot of times it'll come down to resourcing, i.e., do we have the bandwidth to do it right now? And is this a space we want to move into? I.e., is this what we'd call our bread and butter work that we think we can win? And I think, as you'll attest, I was always, if we commit ourselves properly to respond, then I'd be very confident of at least getting through to the next round. And I think that's one of the key things to think about is with these written responses or anything else. The real key here is you're not going to always win off the back of a document, but you are going to hopefully get shortlisted and get in front of the customer. And that's it. And then obviously you move further through the opportunity cycle, but really focusing on can we get through? And sometimes that might be price. We can say, okay, this is where we really want to go. So let's make sure, get the effort as low as possible, get the price as low as possible, and make it too compelling for us to not be left in column 3 and moved up the line.
Yeah. So to a degree, it is a game of strategy, right? As in, it's not a game of, going for the quick kill or the quick win. It's actually positioning yourself correctly for the next part of your campaign, if you like.
That's exactly right, Mark. Spot on. I think seeing that as a first phase, the gating, as we all know, all of these things move through stages. So there'll be the pre-work, but once it comes to, and I'll use a tender as an example here, they've come out as a request for tender document. There's certain requirements they've got to meet and boxes they have to tick, and being very cognizant of what they are, because they're always very clear of the weightings and everything else and what's important, making sure you hit all of those and making it, just ensuring you get through, you're not discarded, and then you're brought through to the next round, because then you can get in front and do demonstrations and further face-to-face meetings where you can then bring in other areas of your pre-sales team.
Yeah, so how important is, if you like, that relationship phase of getting to that face-to-face where your key staff can shine and show their capability and really, once again, get into the customer's mind that that's going to be, you're in safe hands, if you like. It's a risk-mitigated process or proposal to go with you. How do you let's say, create that compelling value proposition? What are those essential elements to get to that next phase?
Sure. Well, I think first and foremost is putting the customer at the foremost. What's in it for them? I think us as vendors are all very precious or see ourselves as very important and like to tell everyone how good we are. That is definitely something that the customer needs to understand. But at the end of the day, more importantly, they're looking at themselves. So what is your industry expertise? Do you understand their industry? Do you understand their challenges? Why are they coming to market with this opportunity? Do you understand what they are, and how would you then resolve them? So, a lot of times people say, well, how do you look at industry and, understand what their challenges are if you haven't worked in there before? I think a great way to do that is look at industry conferences, look at the agenda topics and the actual agendas themselves, what they're actually running there, because you can get a good feel for, okay, great, so these are the 3 or 4 hot buttons that are, really affecting their industry right now, because when they run a conference, that's what they're focusing on. So, leverage those, and it gives you great insight there, and then focus on the benefits, i.e. how you can help them through these challenges, not so much software features. Because I think, again, we get very focused on how cool is this feature in a software application. Do many prospects care? I don't think so. There's a blue one, there's a green one, there's a red one. We've all made our career around a Microsoft solution, so clearly it's important to us. But does a CFO care about that? Not so much. And then risk, I think you mentioned it earlier, that's really important. Showing that you appreciate there's a risk, and more importantly, how you can then mitigate it. Because people want to buy the safe option, especially in government and those sorts of things. People aren't looking to make a radical transformation. Sure, would they like that to happen? Of course they would. But at the end of the day, they're looking at, for want of a better term, an arse-covering exercise of, have I covered off all the risk? Is this a decision I'm making that won't put my department at risk or myself as an individual at risk? So, and that's not just government, mind you, that's across the board. But so putting your hand up, acknowledging the risk and mitigating it. I think a couple of other things that I think are really important. I always talk about how do you explain your job to your mother? So when I think, again, we get very technical a lot of times and go into deep dive, a lot of times your business sponsors and these sort of people certainly aren't technologists, so keep it a very clear, business-focused, top-level, view of the solution, not get deep dive into, the technical aspects of it, because, again, it just doesn't really add a lot of value at this point. And using pictures, a picture paints 1,000 words, it's really imperative. So not leave people to try and imagine or guess what that looks like. I think part of the document response is in, configuring up some basic screens, explaining what this process could look like and make it really easy for the people to visualize it.
Yeah, fantastic. So there's like 3 big takeaways I just took from what you said there. Number one is, you should be able to explain it to your mother what you do and what your technology does, which I think is fantastic, and really it's a mind shift for many people. The next one there that was really compelling for me is that when you're wanting to move into a new industry, and we're going to talk about Lighthouse accounts shortly, but the importance of looking at what that industry conference is and get a copy of the agenda. That is that's like Jedi tactics there, right? To get into an industry, to understand what are their pain problems, because what's going to be on the agenda? Absolutely the issues that are top of mind. And then the third one was the pictures that you mentioned there. And I know in our bids, we were often very cognitive of putting a lot of imagery, because people just don't, some people can't picture things in their mind, right? In a bid, and just
have
a
no
response.
Attention span, mate. That's the other thing. This day and age, who wants to read reams of black and white paper, If you can insert pictures and make it a visual, compelling, easy to read document, you're a long way there.
Yeah. So as part of, you talked about, putting screenshots of how you would see potentially what's been requested in the bid. Would that also be kind of like a start of your demo environment being built, tailored to win this bid as well?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Especially with the cloud these days, we'd spin up an instance, specifically for this opportunity, use configure up the screens as we talked about here for the document, screenshot them, insert them appropriately. But then when we were shortlisted, when we were shortlisted, because that's what we did, Mark, we'd have it there, a long way there all ready to go. So even if they said, look, can you come in and show us something, basically, we'd have a solution. Now, sometimes clearly they're very prescriptive and say we'd like to see these business processes and give you a lot of detail. But equally, just as often is come and do a demo, show us stuff. Well, if you're showing them something that you've configured that makes sense to them, again, from my experience, the majority of people aren't doing that. They've got a default demo system, and there's a lot of, you can imagine what this would look like, or you can picture this, To be honest, I'm not sure a lot of people can. So if you're showing them in their terminology and their words and their business process, it's a lot more compelling.
Yeah, yeah. It reminds me of a little project that we went after, a little project. It was a multi-million dollar project it ended up being in Hong Kong. And I know that this customer had 11 other partners into the account to present, and they all presented a generic demo. And then we were 12th just because we were introduced late into the engagement, and we went in with a tailored demo. And it was, the conclusion at the end of it, we're going with you. Like, yes, we'll sort out the paperwork, but very clearly, because they could see it working potentially the way they would see their world working in the software rather than just a generic, a read between the lines type experience.
Spot on. That's exactly right.
So tell me about Lighthouse accounts. So, one of the things that Microsoft always encourage, system integrators is that you need to verticalize and you need to own an industry vertical. Don't just go after everything. But of course, to own an industry, at some point, you've got to start and get in there and, establish a Lighthouse account. How do you handle those Lighthouse accounts differently when perhaps you don't have the industry experience? You've talked about the conferences, but is there anything else?
I mean, obviously there are times, Lighthouse's accounts are one where it's logically, I guess, a no bid. You'd sit there and look and go, I'm not sure we have a compelling story. But as you mentioned, it's a logo that you want to bring on board. It's a vertical that you want to get into, whatever that may be. So I guess it really is a case of fake it till you make it. So what I've done historically in the past, you might look at your staff at the time and look at their experience, and they may have worked on projects for previous vendors even that have worked in that horizontal. So you can bring those across and say, here's some references where we've done this before. It's, with the team. Now, clearly you need to put that team forward, Bill Smith, he's done this before, so Bill can help you, start to look at the individuals and the individual experience. You can use vendor experience, which I think I touched on earlier. So, this is where Microsoft's done this before. You're not blazing a trail, sort of move the visibility away from you per se to the software at that point. Another key thing you can do is partner. MCS is a good example of where if you want to really separate yourselves, you can partner with Microsoft Consulting Services as an ISV or as a partner. And it's then separating yourself off. MCS will only partner with one person. It puts Microsoft with skin in the game. It gives you a pretty compelling story. So it depends on obviously pricing a lot of other elements, but you can partner to bring in the skills that you may not have and really set yourself apart.
Yeah, so good, so good. So what about, can we break down a bit around the tender response? We've got different types of, RFPs, RFQs, tenders, different approaches that can be taken to these. How do you look at, structured versus unstructured responses? And that, everyone was like, oh, you don't want to go to tender. That's the worst way to buy. But the fact is that, our experience, we did a lot of work in federal government, state government, and they have rules, and rules require RFPs, RFQs, things like that to be done. So you can't just thumb your nose at it and go, no, that's not the way we do business. You've got to work with that framework. So tell me the differences in your mind and how you would handle them differently.
Sure. I think first and foremost, you're always given, as you mentioned, a format or a structure. You must respond like this. Some people will swear blind that you must use their template to respond. I'm very much of the opposite to that. I think you can, as long as you're following their structure and following their sections and numbering, taking that and putting it into your company template, which I'm going to assume is a lot more visually striking and, easy to read, is first and foremost the thing I'd do. Because if you're looking again at a sea of black and white documents that are in a standard government Times Roman format, if you've got a couple that stand out insofar as they're a lot more visually appealing, it really puts you aside. So I really first and foremost recommend that. But I do caveat in saying, keep in mind, a lot of these people will print these out. And there will be different people looking at different sections. So keep in mind each section needs to stand alone. So we may write, this has been answered in question 2 earlier, which may be in a completely different section. John Smith sitting in accounting may not actually have access to the other piece because he's just been snapped off and given his section. So definitely rewrite your response and keep it in a font that prints and is still easy to read. It might look visually fantastic on screen, but, if you're reading pages of it and it's hard to read and that all blends together on paper, not ideal. So in regards to the actual content itself, I think the actual approach generally for an RFP or an RFQ is a lot more detailed, obviously, because they'll drill into a lot more response and things. But as an overall or overarching principle, they're not overly different in my mind. You need to obviously break those out and assign those to the different teams you may be working with. And for smaller companies, it could be yourself being those different teams. But, making sure someone's owning the overall response and the overall tone. I think obviously reusing content, as we all know, is imperative here, be it IP that you're selling or content that you're writing. You don't want to rewrite the question every time, but be very cognizant of the tone. If different people have written these things and they're, different times around different versions of the software, they can very easily, have a use by date and start to sound stale or contradictory, even worse. So really keep that in mind.
So just around the bid response, there's a lot of moving parts in there. You've got subject matter experts, you've got project managers, you've got, the bid manager, you've got architects perhaps involved, and pricing experts, and of course the sales team, pre-sales, etc. Oftentimes, in larger organizations, being on the bench is considered a skill. And what I mean by that, right, is that, oh, look, Bob's on the bench, get him to write the bid response. Well, and it's kind of like, Bob's not skilled in this area. Bob's doesn't, necessarily have a forte for writing, but he's on the bench, so let's use him, know?
Correct.
What are your thoughts around kind of running a bid process? Is it really a project in its own right?
Yeah, it's spot on. It 100% is a project in its own right. And as I like to repeatedly say, availability is not a skill. Just because someone... Look, can people contribute? Of course they can. But to expect someone on the bench who might be a technical developer to be able to then stop writing code and start writing fabulous prose, well, obviously there's a challenge. It's not going to work. So I think I've spent a great time sort of educating upper management about the fact that pre-sales is a skill as much as sales is, as much as a technical architect is. So learning to write and communicate is a valuable skill that a lot of technical people especially just don't have for the nature of their job. It's not what they do. So I think having dedicated or having someone that can specialise that in your organisation, and that's helping them through that. There are always tender writing courses and those sort of things available everywhere globally. Really saying, okay, you've got the most aptitude or desire to be involved, getting people up to speed, getting them to appreciate the skill and constantly refining that. And if you're in the position that you're large enough, you can have someone dedicated to it, all the better. Because like anything in life, the more repetition just basically increases their aptitude. So, but as you say, it is a project. It needs to be resourced as such. Allocated time, people deliver, a timeline, all the things you'd normally have in a project with deliverables. The same thing applies here.
Yeah, so true. So moving through the bid, process, we then go into often, get shortlisted. You go into presentation/demo, and I consider them, like they might be delivered at one time, but really you're going to succinctly present a presentation and including a demo. What are the high-level things you'd want included in a killer demo when going after or presenting to a customer?
Sure. I think the first thing is relevance. Make it about them. I think we touched on it earlier, but a lot of people go in and talk generically about the software and show a generic demo. I'd like to open with 10 or 15 minutes of slides about how good they are and how many great things they've done in the past, We've all got short attention spans these days. Generally people are coming to see what's relevant to them, not what's relevant to you. So really ask yourself, what are we showing the customer here? Start with the stuff that they want to see. I think show, don't imagine it. So as we talked about, configure a demonstration to a business process. So especially through a tender, even if they haven't given you one, you can sit down and have a look and choose one and map one out and step them through that. It's really important to show them something relevant to them. At the end of the day, it's edutainment, I always say. So, everyone's got a short attention span. They'll get bored quickly. So educate and keep them involved and entertained through this, and that's through all the elements of both the demonstration and the presentation itself.
Yeah. It's really at this point, right, that death by PowerPoint it's like the last thing you want in a customer bid scenario is death by PowerPoint. And
100%. I mean, it's a necessary evil, obviously, PowerPoint, but it isn't a book. Don't write an essay.
Exactly.
You know where I stand on this, Mark, and I'm likely to start ranting, so I'll stop. But please, PowerPoint, use imagery, use graphics. You don't need to copy and paste pages from a tender document. If someone wants to read it, they'll read it. You're here to show and explain, so use visual aids to do that.
So good. So what are the essentials for a successful presentation? So what I'm talking about now, we've been shortlisted, we're sitting around the boardroom table, we've got about 15, 20 odd stakeholders potentially in the room. What do you consider the essentials to the success of that hour, 2 hour, 3 hour potential presentation going?
Sure. I think a single voice that everyone speaks to. So from the document through to the deck, through to the demo, reiterate what that in your document you will have had win themes, and we've gone through some of those industry focused, echoing those through that. Repetition is important. Often I've seen, a team will write a tender and get you through, then someone else will go and do a demonstration, have very little, if any, visibility of the tender. And we've had that before where people go and present, go, I know what they want, that's fine. Don't echo it, and it's just literally two different voices from the same company almost talking at cross purposes. So really maintain the same messaging the whole way through. Customization of the deck and the story and the demo environment, again, all need to work in conjunction with each other, but all entirely relevant to the prospect. Scripting, I think, is a really important aspect that I think a lot of people will skip through to a large degree. I mean, you as an individual may know the story you want to tell and may be really au fait with the demo you've built, but what happens if you fall ill or you can't attend? Can anyone else pick this up and follow it? So really having the script, I want to start at this feature or part of the story and step through these features, telling this story to the end. Because, all of us can then forget things as well. If you've got a prompt or a script in front of you, it really makes sure that you hit all those. I think finally practice, like any of these things. We know the stuff, and but really ensuring hitting the value props, are we echoing the document, getting all of those things right, and obviously the PowerPoint as we spoke about. Don't put an essay in there, please.
So you and I often, particularly in the early days when we were flying around the country, going after bids before we'd built, the size team we did, you and I would often go into presentations together, and we had a way of, let's say I was presenting, you were often closely reading the audience and looking for where, somebody you could tell they're like, I don't know about that, and would be able to then, have kind of like a relationship, between the two of us to know when to pivot and let the other person jump in or pick up something. How important is really not having just one solo person in these bids, but having a team at the presentation?
Yeah, it's very important. As you rightly point out, we would have, if it was just the two of us, it was me, but when you've got others, some people set just to, can you watch this side of the room and you watch that side of the room, pick up those body language traits, understand when something resonates with the audience and conversely when it doesn't. And have the trust in your colleagues to be able to let them go, Mark, can I just jump in for a second? I'd just like to. And, because you need to cover those off as you go. If you see someone picking up an issue, sure, you can ask for questions at the end and do all of those things, but there are times where you just don't want to let things sit. And especially, it goes without saying, but at a C level, for example, if it's the CEO sitting there, looking like he's not happy or impressed, to call out there and deal with it, I think is a really important aspect.
Yeah, so good, so good. Just one other area that comes to mind, like as our team grew, there's often 3-4 of us in these type of presentations. And, all of us had, probably me the biggest ego around it. But,
not
but
probably, Mark. Just to jump in there.
But the importance of that, the ego can't be in that room, right? So you've got to, you talked about having trust in your teammates to know their skills and know if they're jumping in, it's not to interrupt you because they've been a prick. They're doing it because they can see, something that needs to be addressed or an opportunity or something that needs to be drilled in deeper.
Yeah, sure. Not a prick unless it was Frank, Mark, just to be clear.
Yeah.
I said I'd mention that for him. No, you're exactly right. But it's trust. All of these things is trust. So understand that, yes, there's like an orchestra, there's a conductor, but there's also everyone else doing really important jobs, in the actual orchestra itself. And just be aware of that and cognizant of that. And again, I think you touched on it, similar teams working together the whole time. And this is where pre-sales and these sort of large opportunities of bids are important, of having dedicated people who, wherever possible, work together. Because it's a lot easier to have that when you're working a lot together with someone versus, subbing in people willy-nilly based on availability or otherwise.
Yeah. And just want to add here is that, everything that we've covered here is based on really in the trenches type, right, experience. And that, I remember when we started off doing a lot of what we're doing less than $1 million a year, and then in 4 years we turned that to around 25 million of delivered work. And so this stuff works, right? Yeah, and the more we got that gelled team together, the more successful, or we increased our run rate, by having this very strong bid, sales, pre-sales, and engagement process.
Spot on. And I think one of the key things on that, you talked about obviously learning and growing, is failure is really important in these things. And any of the tender type processes do give you the ability to ask for feedback at the end and have a session. And I can't stress enough how important it is to take advantage of that and say, well, okay, great, what did we do well? I can give each other a pat on the back, but what didn't we do well? Where did we miss? And then take that away and think, okay, great, let's not do that again. So if you're going to invest this much time and effort and cost, you may as well, take a learning experience out of it. So I can't stress enough. Always ask, if you're not successful, ask for a debrief. Any fair and equitable person will give you one, and it's invaluable, the stuff you'll get out of that.
Nice. So let's move on to the one that I suppose are probably there'll be a few people thinking about. Is that okay? So what about the black art of pricing? Or the that little magic that if you're 5 times higher than your competitor, you've got to have a massive value justification for them. But we both worked for, as I say, a former employer, and we had a very robust pricing model that had been built in Excel over many moons. And can you drill into that, as an example, as one of that pricing sheet, and kind of what was the thinking behind it and the process we went through?
Yeah, for sure. I think, obviously, as you know, pricing is always a factor, right? People will say, we're not choosing on price, etc. Sure, you might not be, but if, as you mentioned, your price is 5 times more, even if you're the best, I can guarantee you're not getting through to the next round. So it's not always the key one, but it is a great influencer. So is your pricing model repeatable? Again, I mentioned IP earlier, and I think we're all aware from a software perspective the benefits of reusing IP. But is your pricing model repeatable? Is it standardized? Can it be peer reviewed, and can it be easily understood? Or are you up to Bill Bloggs uses one spreadsheet that he made up on the spot, or Jane uses something she used at her other company, or it's not standardized, and you can't compare apples with apples. So first and foremost, whatever you're going to do, standardize the process. Again, you can refine that as you go, but really make it simple. I think I'm a big exponent of, when you're doing this, the pre-sales is coming up with an effort. The MVP of hours and days to build whatever that solution is, and wrapped around with the sensible assumptions to ring fence that, but it's not a price. They're coming up with an effort. So they might say it's 100 hours to build that. Fantastic. You hand that across to the sales team to price, because they may price that with, bare minimum margin at cost, whatever that may be. But that's not a pre-sales decision or challenge. What they need to do is come up with the MVP of the effort. And I really want to highlight that, because I think people sometimes get hung up in their heads on price. Now, yes, is price important? Of course it is. But from an architecture perspective or a pre-sales perspective, what you need to do is come up with a minimum effort to build what the customer's asked. So really, wherever possible, separate those things, and then let your sales team or someone else in your organisation take your effort and price it. So then you're not getting caught up in the same things. So what we used to do, as you're well aware, Mark, is price at a feature level. It's very easy to peer review. It's very easy to look for anomalies. It's very easy to see anything that stands out or is a challenge or an issue. Then go through and have factorials against, the overheads of project management time, BA time, training, all of the different elements that make up a project, testing, etc. Be able to easily adjust those percentages as and when necessary to come up with a effort. Now, what that meant was, A, it was always standardised. B, it gave you the visibility to go up the chain in the organisation to a management level and say, right, we've come up with this much effort with this much risk factored into that as a percentage. Are you happy? Get that signed off appropriately. Then the sales team could then go in and play with margins, all in the same spot, and come out with a repeatable outcome. It also meant we could take a subsection of that and, if and when necessary, sit in front of a customer, clearly not showing costs and those types of things, but letting them see at a line item, here are all your features, Mr. Customer, and then that would factor back to a price. Okay, you think it's 10%, you don't have that much money, you want to drop 10% worth of features off, because that's what it is, it's effort. Which ones? Sit there, okay, put a line through that, line through that, line through that. Problem solved, we've now hit the price, move on. But it gives them confidence that you know what you're doing, that you've got a repeatable option. But it meant we did things the same. I could know that anyone in the team was pricing something, I could look at the same thing and know we came up with this, how we got there, and adjusted accordingly.
Yeah, so good, so good. And I mean, one of the big takeaways from that is that often people underprice deals. And if they don't manage, what was the feature dropout, the customer's expectation doesn't change, but your cost structure to deal with it doesn't work anymore. And so then, staff start pulling, 60, 70, hour weeks, and that's not sustainable. It's not good for their mental health, and it's not good for building a long-term team.
No, not at all. I mean, most of these projects, as we all know, you'll sell this first phase, or what they may perceive in their head as a first project or a standalone project, but there's always more things that come in. And I think assumptioning those things appropriately and then be able to say, okay, we assumptioned this for valid reasons, which we all agreed prior to the contract being signing. You're now talking about something, a better version of that or a bigger version or whatever that may be. There's a cost involved and, these become smaller and the project grows and everyone's happy.
Yeah. So one of the scenarios we'd come across from time to time in dealing with global like GSIs in the market is that let's say you'd go in and you would size a project and it was a $2 million project. And, a GSI would come in and go, it's $995,000, we'll do it for. And okay, that's not possible. They win the deal because they do have kind of, that. And of course, the first CR, a change request that comes out, is for $750,000, which is then followed by another 2 or 3 of those, and of course, in no time at all, the project's up to $3-4 million. How do you combat that from educating your customer, knowing, right, you've got experience of doing this over years and years, and your customer is, if you like, not savvy, that the deal's been bought, but in the long run, they're going to absolutely pay for it.
Correct. I think what generally would sit down and say, look, this is what we've architected, and these are the assumptions underpinning that, and make sure they completely understand that, okay, we're talking about doing X, and the assumptions build that out to be, to quantify that for them, and then say go away and compare apples with apples. Are they saying the same baseline for start with? And then secondly, what do those assumptions look like? Are they assumptioning out or, baiting and switching in essence of, they've allowed 1 day of this when we all know it's going to be 50. Great, the price is right, but, hang on a minute, it's a fine detail in the assumptions. So I'd say go away and look at those and compare and contrast. But coming back to what I said earlier, price is always a driver. And some people will, irrespective of how well you try to educate them, say so, and it costs them in the long run. What it does mean, though, in the future is you can use that as a reference. We've certainly had customers in the past who've come back sort of cap in hand saying you were right, can you please help us out of this bind? And that's the best reference you can get. So if you're ever in that position once again, you can go refer them to them and say, look, I know you're in a competitive situation, go have a chat to these guys and they can tell you what happened to them. So.
And of course, anything that's in public media, like a newspaper article, etc., always played very well into our hands in those scenarios where it wasn't you kind of grinding an axe, it was in market knowledge.
That's exactly right. Spot on.
So one of the other things there is I see companies that throw out pricing too soon. In other words, it's off the top. Oh, how much will this be? The customer goes and, someone makes a number, out of thin air. And unfortunately, what they've just done is set the number and there's no room to move. And one of the things you taught me many years ago, even before I moved to Australia, was the concept of the cone of uncertainty. Do you want to explain that and why it's important to understand that concept?
Sure, no problem. So it's a NASA concept, actually. It's probably the most intelligent thing I know, and now I'm going to butcher it and make myself sound stupid. But in essence, as we move through a cone, the less you know, more risk there is, of course. And as you move further through an education process, be it a tender and then further design and documents, you know more and you can be more precise. I mean, the analogy I always use is a lot of customers come to market and say, "G'day, I'd like a house." And people go, "Okay, here's a house that will cost you $250,000. And they go, "Oh, well, okay, that's good." And then someone else will say, "Well, my house cost $500,000. And then they eventually get to the detail and say, "Well, hang on, I wanted 4 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms." And I went, "Oh, well, I was pricing a 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom apartment, And there's this massive disconnect. So until you've actually, like when you do buy a house or build a house, for example, with a builder, you start at a plan, you work your way through, you work out what all the add-ons and everything else you want, and then you come to a final price eventually once you've agreed to all the floor coverings and the curtains and all of those things. Exactly the same exists with software. So, okay, you want a price? Well, we're at this point, that's going to be plus or minus 50%. Oh, well, that's too much risk for me. Great. So I think one of the great sort of selling techniques, I guess, we used through a pre-sales process was agreeing to, okay, well, we've given you an estimate based on what we know and based on your requirements. We're happy to fix that discovery phase up front. where we'll go away and get all of the agreed documentation done, all of the requirements. At that point, we're happy to fix the final price. But that piece up front, if you then said, oh, look, Mark and Jason, we don't want to work with you at this point, that's too much, whatever. The problem is you've still got a tangible document that you can then give to any other vendor who can price, but you've got everything set in stone. So I think that's one way you can definitely get through that.
Yeah, no, very good, very good. And just one last thing around the pricing scenario is that, you might have a bunch of people involved in costing up various feature sets and with uncertainty, people, if you like, add a little bit of fat, right? And so the more one knows less about something, whether it's, developing a plugin or, creating a sophisticated add-on, to a bit of software, etc., the more uncertainty, the more fat that's added in. And then across a pricing process is that if you've got people adding a little bit more fat on Q&A, a little bit more fat on, the various overheads, all of a sudden you're just not even in the game anymore. How do you kind of control that adding the fat all the way through?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it really sort of emphasises the difference between pre-sales architecture, as I like to call it, versus the architecture and the different mentality that you need to apply. So I think using a car analogy, a lot of people will go away and price out a Rolls Royce for customers when really they just needed a sensible small Korean sedan to get them from A to B. So clearly a massive price differential, but at the end of the day, they're a car that gets you around. So I think pricing, we talked about it earlier, but pricing at a feature level allows a review at a single feature line. This can then be adjusted and reflected to a total line item cost, as we mentioned, but it does mean you can look and say, well, hang on, mate, why is there 50 hours applied against this feature where if we use the out-of-the-box functionality, we could maybe do it for 5 hours? And so you're adjusting small adjustments across the board like so, lead to a massive price difference at the end. So as much detail as you can create in a pricing scenario prior to going to the customer gives you that ability to sort of almost trim out the fat. And I mean, the key at this stage, as we talked about, is we need to show we understand with the customer, get our price as trim as possible. Clearly, we're here to make money. We're not a charity, but we need to get our price competitive and get through to the next round of the process. I mean, yes, we've put forward a price. They might want a best and final offer, or they might give you the opportunity to increase it, which we've done in the past. But really, all you're trying to do at this first phase is show you understand, architect something they can appreciate at a price that's palatable.
Yeah, so good, so good. So I want to pivot now to awards and, being successful in winning awards. Together we won a lot of national awards, won a lot of Microsoft and country awards, won a lot of industry awards, even at various state levels over our time. But then ultimately, 2016, we won a global Partner of the Year for Crime, Safety and Justice. And that was kind of, for me, that was kind of like, man, that's awesome. Like, it's.
Didn't you meet Satcher out of that, Mark?
Yeah, I had lunch with him. Yeah, so
just thought I'd work that in for you and your listeners.
Yeah, thank you. That was very nice. It was very nice indeed. But at that conference, I think we were in Toronto at the time, was pretty amazing, win. But tell us a bit about and why I'm asking you, and just for the listeners, is that Jason is the person that wrote the responses that ultimately got us to win these awards. And we just didn't win the big award on day one. It was a journey. But tell me, what is the key things of your thinking when going after an award?
Sure. I think at the end of the day, whilst we get to backslap each other and feel good, the real benefit of the award is it sets you apart and builds credibility, and not only in a prospect's eyes, which it definitely does. If you're looking at two, and like we previously won the CRM Partner of the Year award. If you're looking at CRM partners, hang on, they've won the most recent one. So if it gets down to I'm not sure who to pick, it certainly can tip you over the edge. I mean, it's not going to revolutionise your business, but it is another artefact to help you build credibility. It also helps at the Microsoft side. It builds instant credibility with them, and obviously as the gatekeeper of many leads for your business, fantastic currency to be able to leverage and use and do that. So, from the impact on the business, I guess, it really helps to answer the why you, especially in the close decisions. So if you've won a public sector award, you're going for a tender, fantastic. They've won a public sector award. They must know what they're doing. It really gets you across the line and those sorts of things.
Yeah. And so, I totally agree, as in the clout it gave you inside Microsoft was phenomenal for the 12 months following. It was when you got introduced, whether it was, Hong Kong, Australia, Philippines, Singapore, it would always be, this is our partner of the year. When we won partner of the year for Greater China, once again, in those markets, that's who you get introduced as. You're not company ABC, this is our partner of the year type thing. So tremendously, powerful. And of course, it did definitely open doors for us. But how do you go about winning? So there's obviously, when there's an award category, there is a criteria that your project has been assessed on. What's the angle you come at it from?
It really is echoing everything we've discussed up until this point. You're selling to the awards committee. So you need to show you understand what's important to them and focus on that. So look, Microsoft's very clear up front each financial year around what its strategic goals are in the public domain. Mirror them in your submission. They want to, they obviously want to find good solutions and award partners and all that nice stuff, but obviously they want to use those customers that are involved for their own marketing purposes. So if you've built a fantastic on-premise solution, well, let's be honest, you're not going to win. Right now, that's of zero interest to them. So think about, when you're looking at the suite of projects that you may have delivered in the previous year, which ones hit the Microsoft hot buttons? Which ones, echo what they're saying to market and then echo that back to them? It's exactly the same as a tender or anything else. Understand what's important to Microsoft and repeat that back to them.
Yeah. So do you see it as an important part of being a Microsoft partner? Is that aligning with where their award categories are going? And really, if you look behind that, it's like what I call following the money, because Microsoft award to where their business is going, not necessarily from where it's come from. So how does that, it's more than just the award. How does that flow back into what you're doing as an SI and its success?
I think if you're not structuring your business or following Microsoft structure in essence, mirroring back to them, then you probably need to ask yourself why. Now, sometimes you mightn't agree with some of the structure changes they might make or the way they go to market, all of those things. Well, guess what? They're worth $1 trillion, and I'm pretty confident that you're not. So if you're not following them and understanding where they're putting the money, where they're investing, where they're, building out their solutions, and understanding and leveraging that yourself, then you're doing it wrong, in my humble opinion. I mean, yeah, you might be fine for a year or two, but at the end of the day, you're fighting a losing battle. So understand their priorities, understand why they're a priority as well, obviously, and then come along for the ride. Yeah,
so good, so good. Jason, it's been great chatting to you. I'm going to jump into some quick fire questions. So tell me, do you have any hidden talent outside of work that you rarely share with anybody?
Jeez, maybe you'd need to ask my wife, Mark. Bang, bang.
Well played,
sorry.
sir.
Yeah, thank you.
Well played, sir.
I'd like to fancy myself as a bit of a designer, I suppose. I just renovated my backyard and the interior of my house. So let's go with that, Mark.
Nice, I like it. Tell me, favourite travel destination?
Oh, geez. Probably Vegas, Mark.
Yeah? Honestly, I would have thought you'd taken Bali.
I was nearly going to say Bali, and then I said Vegas because I thought you'd think I said Bali.
Yeah. Probably because you've just been there all last week, right? I was,
correct, Mark. That's right. I've just come back after 10 days.
Nice.
This is far better than a holiday talking to you anyway, obviously.
Yeah. No. Oh, thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. What's the latest gadget that you've bought? I know you're a big Kickstarter fan, and you often buy stuff on there.
I do. I'm trying to think. I haven't really bought anything that recently, to be blatantly honest. I've got an S10 Plus recently. I quite enjoy that as a phone, but it's not really that exciting. I haven't really bought much recently, Mark, I'm sorry to say.
Okay. What's the best bit of advice your dad gave you?
When you're lost, find a policeman. That wasn't very helpful at all, was it?
No,
I'll tell you, my dad was big in retail, so eye level is buy level. So, where it's placed in a shop, and there's a reason they've put it there. So eye level is buy level.
Good. Who do you recommend as a guest for the podcast in future?
Definitely not Frank Hill. Andrew Lee, I'd say, Mark. Andrew, obviously, you'd know, as being a fellow MVP like yourself. He definitely worked, with both of us, I think, closely in the pre-sales process, but also came through from being more on the consulting side and, built through his skills. So I think he'd have some pretty interesting stories to tell.
Nice. I like it. Jason, it's been a pleasure to have you on the show. If people want to connect with you online, what's the best way they can do that?
Probably on LinkedIn, Mark. LinkedIn.com/jace.ferguson, JAS.
Hey, thanks for joining me today on the Dynamics 365 show. I'm your host, Business Applications MVP, Mark Smith, otherwise known as NZ365 Guy. Don't miss out on anything that I'm up to or delivering or content I'm creating by going to nz365guy.com and signing up for the latest training material or interviews that I am doing. Bye for now.